Buenos dias, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. On behalf of Lou, who is not available, I've been asked to both convene and moderate, and it's an honor to moderate today's session. Um, we have such an eminent group of panelists, and I must say, quite a roster of participants. People who have been on the ground, who have been close observers and thoughtful and insightful analysts. So it's quite a collection of people to not not so much digest the results of MC14 because there's lots of commentary from many of you included on what happened and didn't happen there, and you can each give your report card of cup half full, half empty, or quite a mix, but rather this is designed to get us to look ahead, something we've all been encouraging the principals to do without much success so far. So this is oriented towards prospects for the WTO and its membership going forward. We will have three interveners with their own unique insights and a fair amount of time for discussion as well. Um, I need not spend much time introducing them. Former Ambassador Sofia Bozza from Chile. And just to mention that in addition to her permanent representative role, she was the facilitator for the what is still, unfortunately, a plurilateral investment facilitation for development agreement. She'll have something to say about that. I think all of you know Valérie Picard, transplanted to Paris as she is, and the voice of the International Chamber of Commerce. And we certainly need to talk about stakeholder engagement and the fact that governments in designing and trying to maintain rules aren't doing so for their own sake, but for the sake of creating and maintaining a playing field on which business plays. So this is all for the sake of the clients and constituents of the international system. So Valerie and her members are key to that. And Simon, you need no introduction whatsoever. I think everyone on the call and thousands beyond are avid readers who digest your thoughtful insights, both alone and in collaboration with others, some of whom are on the call as well. And I think it's appropriate that at the end of this, not at the end, but after hearing from our other speakers, we turn to you for your reflections and, dare I say, projections and look ahead. We'll then open it up to everyone for comments and the additional wisdom that our membership brings. Um, so with that, and to set the stage, building out from Yaoundé, Sophia, can we start with you to take us from Cameroon to Geneva and beyond?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Jonathan, for the kind introduction, and thank you very much to FMG for the invitation to be here with you today. And special thanks to Professor Lu and to Natalie, Stella for the organization. And I'm very glad to be part of this webinar as I see so many familiar faces and also names in the list of attendants to this meeting, to this webinar. Well, as you mentioned, Jonathan, early March, I finalized my term as ambassador of Chile to the WTO. So the opinions, because there will be opinions, reflections that I will share with you in these 10 minutes that I have, are my own views now from my resumed academic position at the University of Chile. So I don't want to do any type of factual summary as much of you participated in person. There in Yaoundé, I can see some delegates connected. And those who did not participate in person, I'm sure you are very knowledgeable at this moment of what happened, what didn't happen, so I don't want to make any type of factual summary. But to comment what I personally think, were the main takeaways from MC14, considering their systemic implications, and then focus on one of them that is very much related to something that you mentioned already, Jonathan, from my background. Some takeaways, and then I will, as I said, I will focus on the last one that I will mention. First takeaway to me is this tension between national interest and global governance that we could see very clearly at MC14 and even in preparation. Also, related to that, how something that usually was a customary decision as a renovation of the e-commerce moratorium, already since MC13, but more in a more visible way in MC14, turns into a central topic, even a deal breaker. Also, a takeaway, we could see clearly this understanding that there is still in Geneva consensus as unanimity, and that's something that has been discussed and I think will be discussed in the future under the reform process, because it's still that consensus is still unanimity, and we could see veto power during this conference. And another takeaway to me for systemic implications is this Geneva shift. The preparations for MC14 were marked by the Geneva first principle, in the sense of prepare the negotiations in Geneva, so the ministers should not negotiate during the conference, but focus on the reform talks. But finally, as there was not a package delivered in Yaoundé, at least on the spot, now these decisions come back to Geneva in a bold, I can say a bold decision, because Geneva is not usually the place to make the final political endorsement for the topics, but maybe it will work, hopefully it will work. But my last takeaway, and there I will focus, is the one that I think is the most relevant from this conference, which is the rise of multilateral. And there, thinking about that, I remembered a book from Charles Dickens, The Tale of Two Cities, and I think MC14 was the tale of two GSIs, we can say. But those two GSIs, that the entrance point was very different, how they faced the conference was very different, and the specific conclusion about what happened with each of them was very different. I think the general conclusion for the system and what we can extract from what happened with those two GSIs is the same conclusion for the system, and I will explain that. On the one hand, we have FIAC, Investment Facilitation for Development. As you know, this is an agreement that the negotiation finalized more than 2 years ago. And these last 2 years were used at the General Council for the discussion about the incorporation under Article 10.9. As you know, this GSI arrived to MC14 with 128 participants, which is more than 3/4 of the WTO membership, more than 90 developing countries among them. The conference started very well in the sense that we could see, even in the opening ceremony, how Turkey announced that they dropped their opposition to the incorporation of IFP, which was wonderful news, big push. And then during the discussion session about the incorporation, Bangladesh, a very prominent LDC announced they were joining the IFD. So I think this GSI arrived with a very strong political momentum and endorsement of many developing countries. And also, the IFD, as you know, is an agreement that has MFN clause that has been always open to anyone to join, has strong provisions on S&BT. Chapter 5 of the agreement is about S&BT and how to flexibilize the implementation for developing countries and LDCs, and is mostly positive agenda. I mean, it's related to facilitation, respect sovereignty, it's mostly about development, etc., etc., etc. And anyways, it could not be incorporated, unfortunately. Even with all that background that I have explained, it could not be incorporated during MC14 because we have consensus -1, or what some can call veto. So unfortunately, the incorporation could not be achieved, which I can imagine. I'm not part of the participants. I'm not representing any participant anymore, but I can imagine it was very frustrating for the 129 participants of the agreement. Finally, the ministers of the participants, they issued a declaration in which they mentioned that participants in Geneva will think about how to move towards the implementation. ECA, the OSA, there we have 65 plus WTO members that decided not to pursue the incorporation under Article 10.9 at MC14, but to launch an interim arrangement, an interim agreement, and that to start with the process of the entrance into force and then the implementation as soon as possible, and not needing the okay from any third party for that, but as they had an agreement for that, they were able to launch this interim arrangement. So that interim arrangement was very much present in the press. If you look at and I have done that exercise, if you look at the general media, not the specialist media, but the general media, economic media, you will see that one of the main highlights from the conference that you will find in the media was the interim arrangement for the ECA, the e-commerce agreement, which is a big success indeed. So finally, conclusion to extract to me from those two tales. WTO needs dynamic alternatives for progress. And whatever we want to call them, coalition of the willing, groups, friends of the system, whatever we want to call them, I think in the near future they will continue flourishing, and somehow that's a process that will naturally happen. I think after what we saw in MC14, these two GSIs, and I think, as some experts have mentioned, that means a new phase for WTO and for global trade governance. I hope that a new phase, the flourishing of these groups, these coalitions, will complement the WTO with more flexible approaches, and hopefully, and the most important, that they are inclusive, and anyone that wants to participate can participate, and gives the open multilateralism, flexible multilateralism that some are willing. So I stop here. Thank you very much.
Sophia, thank you so much. I'm just going to impose on you to add just one further reflection because the end result of MC14 was, all right, give it back to the ambassadors. It's taken up again in Geneva. And maybe as a setup for Valerie as well, do you want to say a word about the relative weight and engagement? I know you can't overgeneralize, but the engagement of ministers and capitals on the one hand versus leaving it to Geneva on the other going forward. Are these tensions and differences such that we need more capital-based involvement, or we just leave it to the ambassadors to get working for a while first?
Well, it's difficult for me to say because I have not been in Geneva this last 1 month and a half since the conference, so I don't know how things have been progressing. However, yes, I think it was a bold move to say, okay, let's continue in Geneva because Geneva has not traditionally been the place to close a package, and that's something that usually is done during the conferences. But I think as even if very relevant, the issue that was somehow the deal breaker for not having the package was something very specific. Maybe the talks have been continuing during these weeks, and that will give enough possibilities to ambassadors in Geneva to close the package.
Okay, thank you. Valerie, the ICC has been among the most articulate and most proactive in trying to support positive outcomes. I won't ask you to give your own grade, but given the mixed results, give us your look forward.
No, thanks, Jonathan, and thank you also to FMG for the invitation. Hi, everyone. Great to be here. Always a pleasure. I think before we turn to MC14, I sort of wanted to situate the conversation that we're having in the broader environment. Because I don't think we can talk about the multilateral trading system right now without acknowledging the real economy backdrop that against which members met in Yaoundé, in which they're still navigating today. And of course, what I'm referring to here is in part and I'll get to this, is the Strait of Hormuz. But we were there. ICC was on the ground. We have been very active on MC14, and I was there alongside our ICC Secretary General John Denton. And in his remarks at the business forum, so he was the one who started with this at the MC14 business forum, he was already warning about the disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz. And so, warning that this could trigger the worst industrial crisis in living memory, and stressing the consequences for energy markets, for supply chains, for fertilizers, et cetera. And of course, as we all know, in the months since, the situation has only gotten worse, right? The strait's been effectively closed for 2 months. Oil prices have surged. Critical supply chains are under strain, including fertilizers, which has direct implications for food security. And I just want to, and Simon's team has done a tremendous job of monitoring all of this, and they've documented, and Simon will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's already over 100 trade policy interventions in just 7 weeks. And of course, there's at least 18 jurisdictions which have imposed export barriers. And so why am I mentioning this? And I think this also, Simon will maybe talk about this a little bit. I know he's put out a paper on this with some of the colleagues. But from the business perspective, it's clearly there's an immediate test for the WTO, right? So can it bring real transparency to the trade measures now being introduced? Can it help discipline the use of export restrictions? Can it galvanize a coalition of willing members, of members willing to keep markets open in the face of crisis? Questions that we're asking ourselves as the businesses who are navigating all of this turmoil. Of course, none of this was on the agenda at MC14, and I just think it's important because at a moment like this, that gap is difficult to ignore. These are not, none of this is theoretical for the businesses navigating the environment. Businesses are adapting. I think agility is the name of the game in terms of what's going on, but obviously that's not great for business long term or even short term. And so with that sort of against that background in terms of where we are and where we're operating, I think it's important from an urgency perspective. It's one of the examples of the urgency for business, right? Today, what did we go into MC14 with? And what were we asking? So, and what did we not get? And then I think the question for the business community that we're asking ourselves is, okay, where is the immediate priority now coming out of MC14? And of course, then there's the bigger question of reform and what a path forward could look like. So we went into MC14 with two core asks. I know many of you are familiar with them. They were deliberately focused. First, that members or a subset of members, if consensus could not be reached, agree to launch a structured time-bound process on WTO reform. And the second was that the e-commerce moratorium be renewed. If not permanently, at least for 4 or 5 years, so that we don't have this constant renewal every 2 years. These asks were backed by over 230 chambers of commerce and business organizations from every region of the world. They all put their names to the statement. John Denton presented it directly to the Director General in Yaoundé. And to my knowledge, it's the broadest expression of organized business support for the multilateral trading system in many years. And I think that's important, and it tells us something about the level of concern in the real economy. That said, we went in with realistic expectations. We knew the political environment, we still know it. We know the divisions among the members. We weren't asking for miracles, I don't think, just a credible process and the protection of one of the WTO's most important practical commitments to the digital economy. So even with sort of, I would say, tempered expectations or realistic expectations, the outcomes obviously fell well short, to put it mildly. So Sophia's already gone over, and I think everybody knows what happened there. And so really, on the two questions that business had put squarely on the table, Yaoundé did not deliver. And so this is, of course, and as I started, it's particularly concerning at this time of real strain on the global economy. And again, it adds more policy uncertainty at exactly the wrong moment. So, I think for an institution that's already struggling with the credibility problem, walking out of the ministerial empty-handed on issues the members themselves had flagged as priorities, it's not neutral, right? We can't, I don't think it's helpful to sugarcoat it. It's a signal to capitalists, to markets, and of course to the businesses that the system can't deliver even when the asks are modest and the stakes are visible. So where does that leave us in terms of where the business is? The moratorium, I'm hearing from across our network, the fact that it's lapsed for the first time in its 26-year history is historically significant. Everybody, I think, here knows that every business depends on cross-border digital trade. All the businesses that depend on cross-border digital trade, which means essentially almost every business today, is now operating with less certainty than it did a month ago. And of course, that will fall heaviest on the SMEs. And I do want to say there's been one constructive development from our perspective since Yaoundé, and that's the 23 WTO members who issued the joint statement committing to maintain the moratorium. And that was something that we welcome this, the global business community very much welcome this. It's a pragmatic and constructive response, and it's exactly the kind of leadership that the business community had called for at MC14. But I think we need to be clear about what it is and what it isn't, right? So in this case, and I'll say in this case because I will come to this because plurilaterals are obviously very key to the future, that commitment among the 23 members is not a substitute for the stability and universality of a permanent multilateral moratorium. And so for us from the business community, that is the immediate priority right now, is to renew, and that is to broaden that participation, that joint statement, and to use it and to get it back into and to get back to a multilateral agreement on it. And of course, then it comes to the bigger question, right, in terms of on reform, which now looms even larger than it did before Yaoundé. And so what happens next? And so I think I'm hearing, we already heard around plurilaterals. And I think that's also very much the way, of course, the business community is we're thinking as well about this. WTO has 166 members. We know those members do not and will not want the same things from the system. I think it's quite clear from at least, and I don't think it's necessarily a failure. It's just reality, and I think that's what's also guiding our thinking. That is just the reality. So right now the system, which requires everyone to agree on everything, is a framework designed for paralysis at the current moment. And so that is not a way forward. We've already talked a lot about this around the need for more flexibility in the system and plurilaterals and variable geometry, which was going to allow willing groups of members to move forward. So, and I think for the business community, as I mentioned, that's very much where the future lies in terms of moving forward. And we do want to say that we saw the decision on the e-commerce agreement by 66 members. That's a positive sign. That's a common sense, that common sense trade cooperation remains possible and certainly should be seen as a template for more flexible approaches coming out of the current paralysis. So we need we're not going to say anything new that we didn't sort of say before MC14, but just to really reiterate it, is very much needing to find a solution to that the plurilaterals and the coalitions of the willing can move forward. I just, to close the loop and just to come back, because it doesn't mean when we're, that the multilateralism option is obsolete, not at all, that in terms of 166 members agreeing on something. There's certainly, there's a role and I think a need for certain system-wide commitments. For example, the moratorium, which is a clear example. The point, I think, is that the multilateralism today can't carry the full weight of the system on its own. So what we see is both tracks have a role to play, and what members need to think carefully about is which questions are best advanced through which. And from our perspective, the plurilaterals really have an opportunity to make trade work better. And certainly for the businesses that are operating every day. And then I will also say, because this is so extremely important, and thank you, Jonathan, for raising this immediately in the intro about the stakeholder engagement. I will say this, and I will repeat it until I'm blue in the face, but we absolutely need to find a way forward on business engagement for the future, or the WTO of the future, however you want to frame it. And we need to be, I would also say, and there also needs to be a role for us during the reform process. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here and to be exchanging with all of you on this. And I think it's important that sort of institutionalized mechanism for private sector engagement, it doesn't mean an open door and sort of private sector running rampant in every single conversation. That's not, to be really clear, that's not what we mean. Of course, there needs to be guardrails. Of course, it needs to be, and I think that's where the structure is actually really important, because it actually then protects the way business feeds in its viewpoints into the work of the WTO. So it's really finding where's business input, where can we be useful into those conversations. I have ideas. I won't go into it all here. We don't have time. But again, it's finding the right formula. And of course, obviously, and I think as Sophia alluded to, it comes down to sort of, in terms of next, is the coalition of the willing. So from our perspective, and the question really is, is which governments are prepared to step forward and build the coalition needed to advance the reforms that are needed. And maybe just to close, and I always do this, I forgot to look at what time I started speaking, but I'll just say, ICC, we were founded in 1919. We were founded out of the ashes of the First World War. I don't know if everybody sort of knows that history to it. And it was a bunch of business leaders who believed that open trade and predictable rules were the foundations of peace and prosperity. They called themselves the Merchants of Peace. We still believe that today. This is why we still do that work. And we need, coming back to those original, the predictability, the certainty. I think everybody knows this is what business needs more than anything at the moment. So we're really happy to show up and to work with anyone who wants to fix it. And I just say there is urgency. So from our perspective, we really need to move because business is happening now. So hopefully I didn't go on too long, and I'll hand it back to you, John, and say thank you.
No, not at all. Very articulate and very comprehensive. Simon, before turning to you, let me just highlight a few things that we collectively may wish to come back to. This is framed as sort of a look forward into the medium term, but you've highlighted a more immediate concern triggered by events in the Gulf and their consequences. And that is the transparency and impact of measures being taken in the short term, export controls among them, and other trade restrictive measures. I would recall that there was a collective decision at the WTO at the time of COVID when emergency measures were taken. It was a declaration, not a formal binding decision, but it said measures taken in times of national emergency should be temporary, proportionate, and transparent. And that had to do with PPEs and so on, and helping to ensure the continuity of cross-border supply for public health. I'm not aware, I haven't been in Geneva, but I'm not aware of any such collective effort to try and build guardrails around these measures now. That's something we may want to come back to. Both of you have highlighted the variable geometry and the plurilateral strain, which is now very much in the mainstream. I know Hamid will add to this debate because he's written and thought quite a bit over many years about plurilaterals within the multilateral system. And stakeholder engagement, simply to observe, we have models, various models to draw on. The OECD has a standing business industry advisory committee and a labor advisory committee. APEC has ABAC, the Asia Business Advisory Council, and so on. There's no single recipe, but there's lots of models to take inspiration from that WTO members may wish to consider. Just to flag, and Peter Unperforn has written about this, none of you have mentioned some of the looming big issues that no one expected to be resolved in MC14, but are certainly out there. The future of MFN, as put on the table by the United States and to some extent the EU in its paper. The 50-year saga of not making any progress on agriculture. Aside from the moratorium on tariffs on e-commerce not being extended, nor was the moratorium on non-violation, nullification, impairment on TRIPS. That's another complicated uncertainty added to the mix for the business community. And of course, trade and climate was all in the corridors and not in the main meeting rooms for the most part, and with CBAM coming, that looms fairly large. So just some triggers in advance of our discussion, but Simon's going to resolve most all of this in advance, so we turn to Professor Evanet for the future vision, please.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm afraid I may disappoint you if that is the case. I'm going to put on the table another option, which I think should be given serious consideration, given the piling up of all of the unresolved issues that we are seeing in Geneva, and the decision of certain WTO members to depart from key multilateral norms. And so I'm going to make the case for active unilateral custodianship of the WTO by the members who keep telling me that they absolutely value a rules-based system. I have some speaking notes which I will circulate to the FMG people, and they can share them as well. I'm trying to, I will summarize them here. So let me start by making this case for active unilateral custodianship. I want to start with a sentence that I'd like you to take from this intervention. Reform is about changing the system. Custodianship is about making sure there is a system left to change. These are not the same thing. They're not in competition. They operate at different levels. And at the moment, at best, one of them is happening. And it's the gap between them that I'd like to talk about. I see the WTO operating at two levels. The multilateral trading system has two distinct problems working in parallel. The first is an operational level, which involves negotiations, transparency, deliberation, and enforcement. I think it would be fair to say that all of those elements are falling short, but we live in hope that the reform agenda will address them, and these discussions should continue. The second problem is different, and I think becoming increasingly problematic, and this is that we are seeing a slow erosion of the multilateral trading system's principles of MFN, transparency, predictability, and level playing field, as the daily practice of certain WTO members drifts away from them. And as you noted, Jonathan, there are even actual proposals to weaken some of these fundamental principles. Now, this is not because anyone has repealed the rulebook yet, but we seem to have too many governments that once invested political capital in operating these principles are no longer prepared to do so. I want to advocate that custodianship is the name I want to give to addressing this second problem. I want to be clear, however, that custodian can simultaneously be an ardent reformer of the system. These are genuine complements, but we should not collapse custodianship into reform, because we will lose something. We will need to address this strategic level. So let me tell you what I think custodianship is. Custodianship is the practice by which WTO members demonstrate through their own conduct affinity with the principles of the system and a determination to align their behavior with those principles in novel and more expansive ways. This is not as a legal obligation, but as a voluntary and deliberate choice. I want to address something directly because I know this audience's instincts, and this audience will be asking themselves, especially if they're in the delegations, what am I being asked to agree or to refuse? And the answer simply is nothing. There is nothing here to negotiate. Unilateral custodianship doesn't require a mandate. It doesn't produce a text. It cannot be evaluated by the usual give and take criteria that we see in Geneva. I'm not against groups of WTO members moving ahead on an MFN basis, but negotiations take time, and the regression that we are seeing day in, day out is eating away at the WTO edifice, and this is why we need an additional initiative. What are examples of custodianship? I'll give you three. The first refers to appealing into the void. We know that a responding party in a WTO dispute can now appeal into the void, and the appeal goes nowhere. This is the current situation. In my view, a custodian commits not to use this legal tactic, and when a panel has ruled against them, they either accept the ruling, or if they're a member of the MPIA, they can pursue a legitimate review through that course. We don't need to negotiate anything. We don't need a new text here. Countries just need to agree. A country just needs to state that that is going to be their practice, and this, for me, would be one test of being a custodian. The second example, and this builds on what Valerie was saying about the current crisis, we have indeed found 35 export measures, export barriers put in place by countries. But in my view, a custodian doesn't wait to notify eventually what they're doing. They notify immediately various aspects, the rationale for a measure, the evidential base the instrument chosen and why that instrument was chosen. They are explicit about the products covered and about the expected duration of a measure, and they will provide information on the criteria which would trigger the removal of a measure. Furthermore, a custodian doesn't wait for a committee meeting and a request for consultations. They would convene meetings and answer any questions from WTO members. This would just be an example of going beyond the traditional practice in Geneva and would be a path-breaking form of transparency. So this is a second example. A third example is voluntary supplementary financing for the WTO. We have a situation with an organization with a budget, I believe, of around 200 million Swiss francs. This budget has not seen a real terms increase in over a decade. The consequence is that the Secretariat is poorly placed to monitor the very trade interventions that have been mentioned. They cannot provide analytical support to smaller delegations, and this holds back their meaningful participation, and the Secretariat cannot invest in needed data and infrastructure and talent. And so in my view, a custodian pays their contribution on time, which unfortunately not every member does, and they make voluntary supplementary contributions to one of the WTO's existing trust funds to help strengthen this institution. So in this way, essentially, a government contributes to the global public good. Now, myself, Petros, Bernard, and Alan have independently come up with other ideas about what a custodian could be. I think there are dozens of other things that custodians could do, but these are three unilateral measures that get taken. Now, as I've said before, the distinction here is that custodianship refers to the gap between the current legal obligations and optimal practice. Custodians are expected to comply with their WTO commitments, but go further, to interpret their obligations broadly, to eschew exceptions they are entitled to invoke, to notify more than they are required, and to reinforce the institutional foundations of the trading system. So what we can see here is, instead of accepting that regression is the norm, instead of lamenting the various malpractices that have been undertaken in the past few years, we have an alternative, which is some countries can unilaterally show their fealty to this system and translate their statements of support into something more concrete. As I said at the beginning, reform changes the system. Custodianship ensures that there is a system left to change. And at the moment, we have at most one of these things happening. And in the interim, the termites are being of the system termites are eating away at the system. So there will be less left for this reformed system to work with. So let me close by saying the following, is that many trade ministers and delegations, especially from small and medium-sized countries, say that they support a rules-based multilateral trading system. What I do not see is a strategy to translate that support into action. And so these affirmations remain aspirational. If we had such a strategy, we could translate this affirmation into identifiable conduct, and this conduct could be reciprocated and could form the basis of further cooperation down the road. I want to stress that the important thing about being an active unilateral custodian is that you go beyond what the minimal obligations are, and you show that these principles are important. And so essentially, custodianship is a determination to align behavior with multilateral trade principles, to show that their reach can widen, and to demonstrate by their acts, not their words, that regression is a choice, and it's not a destiny. And so what I want to put on the table is that we do not have to, not everything has to be negotiated. There's a lot of agency that individual WTO members have, and there is a lot that the small and medium-sized economies who keep saying that they value this system could do if they want to show that regression of this system is not the only alternative. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Simon, and we all look forward to you circulating the paper, and I know there's some co-authorship behind that as well. Let me ask a further question because you're globally in demand. You're in touch with various people in various countries. You talk about middle powers unilaterally, but we have some caucuses of some sort. You have the somewhat moribund but Ottawa group that was created to be the voice of middle powers. You have New Zealand, Switzerland, others slowly building out the so-called FIT-P group. That's not supposed to be a negotiating group, but a conscience for the rules-based system. You have the seeds of EU CPTPP dialogue, not so much to negotiate a bilateral merger, but also to be a voice. Um, do you think it valuable to invest in these caucuses? We have an APEC trade ministers meeting coming up in May as well. Or does this need to be Geneva anchored and focused? And I see we have Alan and Alejandro waiting as well, but maybe a quick response to that.
Sure, and let me be clear that those unilateral proposals for custodianship are ones I take responsibility for. I think the paper which Alan and myself and Bernard and Petrus put out also had plurilateral alternatives, which provides the segue to your answer, which is this, the defense of this system does not have to be Geneva based, but since we were, and there are many alternative venues out there, which I know some countries wish to explore. I'm personally more optimistic about FIT-P than I am CPTPP EU, but that's for other reasons. That's for sort of just pure operational reasons. In general, I think what I wanted to put on the table here is that even in Geneva, when one thinks about a country, thinks about its membership of this system, the default, which is to always think about what do I have to negotiate, this ingrained instinct is it's valuable, but it's not the only game in town. There are things countries can do on their own, and I think we ought to be exploring this because, as we've seen, and Valerie laid this out, I'm afraid sometimes the negotiating clock doesn't tick very quickly. Thanks.
Sorry. I'm going to turn to Alan and then Alejandro, but with some advance warning, I know Hilda and a few others are on the line. If there were results at Yaoundé, a few of them, modest as they were in favor of least developed countries, some incremental progress on operationalizing special and differential treatment and a small economies mini package and so on. So I'd be interested to add to our mix a developing country perspective coming out of MC14 as well. So with that, Alan first, followed by Alejandro.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, and thank you very much to the three speakers who are both provocative and informative and show us some of the ways forward. I was there during at the WTO during the COVID response, and I can testify that there wasn't one. There was a declaration, yes, in 2022. COVID had crested by then, but COVID was much earlier. And there was the invocation of targeted, temporary, and whatever it was, the three T's, but no real.
Transparent, yeah.
Transparent, thank you. And it was an invocation. It was like a mantra, but it didn't do anything that I know. There was a meeting that was very good of the General Council in which each member came forward and said, "Here's my problem. Here's what's going on in my country or to my country, and I want to tell you about it." And then no follow-up. So here we were. John Denton, according to Valerie, spoke up about fertilizer and energy. And did any minister I know not all ministers were there, and many who were important were absent. But did any minister say, "We're here during a crisis. What should we do about it?" Why didn't they adopt what Simon had to say, sort of up front, to have some response? Um, so I think coming to grips with crises, if you're going to list the crises rather than the reforms, I'd say food security is a crisis. Now fertilizer is a crisis. Energy is a crisis. Climate's a crisis. E.g., the Environmental Goods and Services Agreement, worth talking about. The AI, the coming of AI, it's in our newspapers every single day as to what's happening with respect to AI. It also affects trade, and it is not a subject for discussion that I know of. The middle powers, as Simon said, it's time for them to stand up and come forward. They say that they can carry the burden. They say they can do wonderful things, or at least Mark Carney said so. So it's time to do so. So a new Ottawa group, maybe Jonathan would be pressed back into service to lead it. The Yesterday, Richard Baldwin, colleague of Simon, spoke at the Peterson Institute, and he said the system. He described the system in glowing terms as if it were working very well because of the initiatives on the plurilateral basis that some say is outside the system, and I say is inside the system because the platform was provided by the WTO, and it's WTO people who put it together. I mean, the representatives to the WTO for the ECA. I underline the payment of dues point that Simon just made. It's absolutely crucial. There are very small countries who decide that they'll spend their money on other things than paying their dues. And there are poor countries who decide they have other priorities that are representational, that we noted when we were there. And there's no penalty, really, at all for non-payment of dues, including to the United States when it didn't. Um, so I also, just one other point I'd underline, stock taking. There's value in the WTO that business sees. Customs Valuation Code, crucial. TBT, the technical barriers to trade, absolutely crucial. SPS, to ask the farm community whether it cares about the SPS agreement, and it certainly does, I think, in every country. And we don't herald those things and put them forward. So I look forward to new forms of leadership taking place, and I think we'll see them. And that's why I say, as Jonathan mentioned, the Ottawa group. I thought at the time the Ottawa group minus 12. It was 13 members. If it just went forward minus 12, it would have just been great. It's with the other 12 it couldn't quite make the grade. So thank you.
Thank you. And just to note, participants, that Simon has kindly put his email in the chat for those who want a copy of his remarks or the follow-up or background paper. Dr. Hatta, nice to see you.
Thank you, Ambassador Freed. Yeah, good to be here. Greetings to all. Great session. I want to commend particularly Valerie, the distinction she's made between what is urgent and what is important. And I see the value in terms of this coalition of the willing. And I see several things that tie up with that, particularly Simon and his colleagues' idea about the custodianship and things that can be done unilaterally and others should be done collectively. It doesn't take all members, it's just a coalition. But I think it's a very important thing to emphasize the need to make a political commitment to keep markets open and to get the wheels of transparency and information going. And I think here the GTA has a lot to do, the same with the WTO Secretariat, the same with see Luz Maria de la Mora here is in this session, I see with UNTAD, I said others can chip in and get better information. And it's not only about this crisis with the Gulf crisis. Let's not forget also the Russian invasion of Ukraine, ongoing war there, which still causes a lot of hardship around the world to others. So that's what's urgent. And I would hope that Valerie can be more present in our discussions in the future while we think about this, and we can work together. And I hope that the ICC can mobilize the national chambers of commerce, and many of us will be willing to work in our domestic jurisdictions to put pressure on governments to do something in terms of what is, again, urgent and what is important. The important, of course, is the reform of the system. And Valerie has said there's no credible process of reform. It will not come to happen in the WTO as we know it in the near future. This is going to be discussed elsewhere. We will see where exactly, but we also need to impress on governments that that is very, very important. So there's a lot to do, and again, thank you very much. And I emphasize, I hope that ICC, Valerie, you will be more present in our debates. And I apologize beforehand because I think I'll have to leave to attend a domestic urgency. Thank you.
Alejandro, thank you. Just to remind, please use the chat or raise your hand to join the discussion. I'm not trying to put Hilda or others on the spot, but if anybody wants to add a developing country or LDC perspective on things, that would be welcome as well. And of course, our three panelists may wish to respond to the comments thus far. Peter.
Thank you, Jonathan. You asked an interesting question of Sophia just now. The issues at the Ministerial Conference were discussed in Geneva. They were taken to the Ministerial Conference. They've been brought back to Geneva. My sort of innocent question in response to that is, if it didn't work in Geneva at the beginning, why is it going to work in Geneva now? And the only possible answer is that maybe something happened in Yaoundé that causes people to change their minds. But I'm not sure much did, maybe a little bit. But I think the test of that, or the proof of whether something has changed or not, maybe next week in the General Council, when some of those issues will be coming up. And so a lot of us are watching to see very closely what happens in the General Council, and whether it's any different from what happened in Yaoundé. There's another very interesting angle to that question about the difference between Geneva and capitals. And the question really is, it's one that Bob Wolf and I, my co-author on the blog, have been asking for a long time now, is there anything happening in capitals that would inspire or give permission to ambassadors in Geneva to move? And I think that same question, I think Alejandro sort of hinted at it, it also applies to the private sector. It's all very well ICC handing a letter over to the Director General of the WTO. It may be sort of a necessary condition, but it's nothing more than symbolic, because what really matters is what's happening in capitals. And from the private sector point of view, and it's something that Bob and I, particularly Bob, raised in our sort of postscript to Yaoundé, is there are sounds that we would have thought we would hear from within the capitals, from finance ministries, from business, and so on, that might move things forward in the WTO. But no, the dog didn't bark. And so my question is a little bit like what Alejandro had said just now. It's not really about ICC at an international level pushing for WTO reform. It's about whether the national business representatives are pushing at all. Now, none of us can follow what's happening in 166 capitals, but some of us can follow what's happening in maybe 2 or 3. And we don't hear anything at all that business is saying to their ministers and their governments that say, this is urgent, you've got to do something about the WTO. And personally, I don't think that there will be any incentive on ministers to move or senior officials in capitals to move unless there is a political impetus from stakeholders in the capitals as well.
Peter, thank you for that. I know Hamid is waiting, but Valerie, maybe you want to respond to Peter first?
Or it's happy to give Hamid, but I was just going to come in and just respond on and sort of say 100%. And so the way we work on our advocacy, and I think this is quite important, is that you're seeing me, I'm sitting here and we're engaging at the multilateral level, but we, through our national committees and our network on the ground, they are speaking to their businesses. So for example, I mean, I can give you, I'm in touch with our network. I was in touch with ICC Brazil, and they've just spoken to our government, and ICC Costa Rica. I can go on and on and on, but as you can imagine. And so what the letter symbolizes is, you can imagine behind that letter, that was shared also with national governments. Afterwards, whether or not the business community is heard is of course another story. But we're always engaging on 2 levels, because 100% those discussions or capitals are really important, and certainly always happy to see how we can do more, how we can mobilize more our network. But that is, just want to say, 100%, that is the name of the game. So it has to be, it's in both places, and that we're all speaking with one voice, and so that they're hearing the same message in Geneva as they're hearing in their capitals.
Okay, thank you. So Hamid, then back to Sophia.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Simon, Sophia, and Valerie, for excellent presentations. I think I'm not going to get into the substance because we won't finish if I get there. But let me just highlight one important thing, really. There is, in my view, a hidden blessing in Yaoundé. And that hidden blessing is the shocking wake-up call that actually everyone should listen to. There are historical precedents for situations like this, where you have a failed ministerial that actually mobilizes a lot of energy for people to actually look forward and get serious about reform. The GATT 1982 ministerial, John Weeks would remember that, which was actually the beginning of mobilizing a lot of inspiring efforts that led to the launch of the Uruguay round. The Seattle shock for the WTO, which played an important role in mobilizing energy towards the Doha declaration. I think we are in a crisis, deep crisis moment now, and that, I think, should be highlighted. I don't think you can over dramatize the situation. This is why I do have a bit of a problem with the PR narratives that are being put out there just to mitigate the situation and say, oh, it wasn't really that bad, we were so close, we just ran out of time and all this. I think this actually numbs the situation. This really it dulls the wake-up call. I think that's very, very bad now. We should actually say this is a crisis. It can be disastrous. And that feeds into this conversation we were just having about capitals. Why are capitals silent? Well, because maybe they have the wrong impression coming out of Geneva, that the situation is not that disastrous. But also we should be fair towards capitals. They're distracted by so many other things going on. So unless really they get a severe wake-up call saying, hey, the system is eroding. I mean, as Simon was saying, the termites are eating into the foundations. And with the passage of time, we normalize dysfunction and it becomes a new normal that the WTO doesn't work because there are violations every day with impunity. Well, that in itself is a very toxic formula that with the passage of time would really erode the system to a level that it won't be that easy to repair it afterwards. And I see what Simon is saying about the custodianship, which is the urgent action now, because we might not really end up with much to reform later on. Now, whether things are going to work back in Geneva, I have great doubts. I actually don't think that this decision to say, oh, we ran out of time and let's go back to Geneva and we're going to wrap it up. I'm not sure really that this was anything more than a momentarily face-saving PR statement to make. Instead of saying, sorry, we're going back empty-handed. Now, put all this together, I think my point here, out of everything I just said, is we need to face the truth. This is going to be the first step in trying to do anything useful, is to face the truth. And the first step towards solving any problem is to just face it with intellectual honesty and political courage. Now, let me stop here. I might have more comments to make later. Thank you.
On that optimistic note, let's turn to Sophia.
Well, I will add one more background element to the list that you built, Hamid, about ministerial conferences that finally were a wake-up call. We can think also about Buenos Aires, MC11, that their plurilateral started. So somehow it was also a conference in which results were mixed, not very successful, but finally one of the results was the launching of plurilaterals. I just wanted to address the comment from Peter, the question about Geneva before the conference, Geneva after the conference. Well, I think it's a bit different. Finally, the objective is the same, because the objective is having this Jande package, but I think the moment is different, because before the Ministerial Conference, the work in Geneva was the preparatory work under this Geneva First Principle and trying to have documents that were digestible for ministers and were not negotiation text, but something that they could endorse during the conference. That was not successful, we know, but if we go to that set of documents that arrived to the ministers before the conference, it was much longer than what we have right now, because there were documents about agriculture, fisheries, reform, economic moratorium, TRIPS moratorium, outcome documents, incorporation of IFP, etc. And now we have a smaller set, and what I saw during the conference, not having participated in the negotiations, was that the deal breaker was something very specific. That's why, even if I agree with Hamid that even if finally the Jande package can be closed, can be delivered, it will be a very modest package. So we have to face that reality, face why things could not be closed during the conference, and I agree with him. But I think what Geneva is facing now, and I really don't know what has been happening in the last weeks. So, but what Geneva had to face or had to deal with during these weeks was a very specific set of decisions, and the deal breaker was very specific topic. So maybe if that can be solved, maybe the package, the Jande package, can be a reality, but it will be a modest package because the outcome document is not there, the incorporation of IEC is not there, there's nothing on agriculture, etc., etc. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me add just a couple of elements to trigger some further discussion. If you take Simon's premise that, keep the system going, I mean, in effect, provide a basis for future, more meaningful discussions, even some of the protagonists, including the United States and China, have said there are elements here that aren't being respected that are pretty basic. Notifications, not timely, not comprehensive. And maybe there needs to be cross notifications. That's consistent with Alan Wolf's earlier observation about, and Simon's, about voluntarily coming forward when you take a measure. And that's the basis for discussion. And after all, one of the small ongoing successes is the track record of SPS and TBT in flagging concerns, because out of the thousands of notifications, there's maybe 5 or 10% that ever make it to formal consultations and dispute settlement. The power of peer review and being called to account can and does work. So maybe there needs to be doubling down on those preconditions that are built in to the system. The second thing, we've talked about Geneva versus capitals, but the other element that influenced, obviously, and provided some of the foundations for Uruguay round results was work done in other fora. So, for example, all the OECD work that went into producer subsidy equivalence provided the foundation for the tarification of agricultural support, and thus a basis for at least the start of an agriculture negotiation. Should we be mixing in addition to capitals and major stakeholders such as the ICC, what are those other fora? Where else can research, evidence, and data be consolidated and brought to the attention of negotiators and capitals as a foundation for results? The OECD obviously has done quite a bit of work on services, their services trade restrictiveness index, for example. There's a lot of work going on digital, but I don't see a concerted, and again, we go back to middle powers or caucuses, I don't see a concerted effort to double down and reinvest in proactive initiatives in such for additional trade-related research and work to be done. Alan, you want to rejoin?
Just very briefly, honesty would be useful. We talk about transparency. We don't really mention the fact that, for example, the Biden administration had all of these subsidies, many of which were GATT, WTO consistent, but didn't own up to it. I probably share with a lot of others the problem of making the GATT and the WTO too legalistic. So, the U.S. had an import surcharge in 1971, and it said, yeah, we could have done worse, because at the time you could only use quotas. You couldn't use a surcharge under the rules. But they at least said, we did it, and we could have done worse. And you didn't want us to do worse. And of course they lost. That's all right, because they would have lost under the rules. We've lost in a confrontational atmosphere the ability to countries to say what their real problems are and why they did them. Sabine Weyand, according to the press, announced that she was leaving the European Communities Commission trade service, retiring, which was not unexpected. But one of the points of difference the press said existed is that the EU was saying that its deal with the United States was WTO consistent, and it isn't. Simple as that. So we've lost something, and I don't know how we get it back. But it's worth thinking about what's the nature of transparency, what's the nature of deliberation, what's the difference of owning up to what one is doing. If Biden said, look, where the world is burning up, we need to give subsidies for EVs. We did it in a way that is unacceptable under the rules, but it was an emergency, and we did it. And it was politically the only thing we could do. It would be better than simply pretending that the rules don't matter or don't exist.
That opens up yet another dimension, which can be the topic of another webinar for us, which is, you know, the member-driven organization, and particularly now, some of the major players are putting severe constraints on the Secretariat's ability to volunteer information that is publicly available. The media, the FT in particular, has done a reasonably good job of highlighting some of the evidence, picking up on Simons and global trade alerts and other sources, but it's not sustained and it's not picked up on. So interesting to ask, given the wide availability of publicly available information, and that goes straight through to issues not fully engaged, like industrial policy and subsidies. What's the role of the media? What's the relationship between the stakeholder community and the media in feeding into governments, whether in Geneva or in capitals as well? We had hoped to have Peter Foster from the FT join us today. We have Keith Rockwell on our roster of FMG. That may be worth a follow-up discussion as well to live up to Alan's plea for honesty and transparency. With no more than 10 minutes remaining maximum, I'm going to go back to our panelists since I don't see any hands or comments being volunteered at the moment because there's so much food for thought. Hamid, but then I'll go to each of our panelists for their
just
final
30,
reflection.
30 seconds. I think what I want to say really is we need to look at this moment of truth now. And as Valerie said, the reality is that the 166 don't want the same thing anymore from the system. That's the true reality. And I think capitals need to know that. You know, my previous intervention about the blessing in MC14 as a crisis actually was an optimistic tone. Maybe I wasn't clear putting it across like that. But what I wanted to say really is, can we try not to let the crisis go to waste? Use the crisis to draw the attention and the focus of capitals to the fact that something serious is going on here, because I think that's a gateway question for us to make sure to at least try to look at what's coming ahead in a more positive way. And when we talk about different scenarios, I think we also need to keep in mind we're not talking about what is likely to happen, but we're talking about what is worth trying. Because sometimes in different discussions, people say, oh, but this is not going to happen. Oh, this is not likely to happen. No, I'm not optimistic about this. That's not really the sort of way to think creatively about how we get the system out of this, this trouble. Thank you.
Thank you. So, with no further interventions visible to me at least, let's go back to the beginning. And Sophia, you've digested a lot from quite a range of perspectives. I'll ask for your reactions, and then Valerie, and then Simon gets the last word. Sophia.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for giving me the floor again. Well, it's difficult to me to all of the ideas right now because, as you said, there have been very interesting reflections, and I really appreciate being part of such a relevant discussion. I think finally, to me, the thing is finding ways to improve the multilateral trading system's governance. It's about governance to me, especially in this moment of stress. The system is under stress. And there, I really, something that I really see very relevant is a reflection from Simon about agency. I think it's necessary that members feel they have agency on this, because having been the last almost 4 years in Geneva, sometimes you don't feel that. You feel a lot of frustration and not a lot of agency. So, and I think that's something very relevant, that members feel that they have agency, that they can participate in things that finally give fruits and finally produce something that is relevant for exporters, for the private sector, for the stakeholders, because finally that's the reality. The discussions, the final objective is to have an impact on trade flows and on development. That's the final objective. Sometimes we forget about that, and we are involved in the Geneva Principles, rules, and the discussions there. But that's the objective. So we have to find a way to improve this MTS governance that is under stress right now, and giving more agency to members and less frustration. I think it's a way, because despite the current crisis, I think the WTO, the MTS remains an irreplaceable forum. So we have to find a way to move on. So thank you.
Jonathan, you're on mute.
All of which was just to say Valerie.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I think I sort of starting out same places as Sophia, sort of thinking about, I think from the business, the age we're living in, we're living in the age of complexity, and certainly, and also regulatory uncertainty. And that's where we're navigating. So we really want to find the pathways forward. So as I was listening to all of you, and I was thinking, I think there's to the call that was made during this call as to where we can, what more can we do to help move this forward. I had some ideas listening, I think there's areas of work around transparency. I think it's important, that we, I think business should also, like, we can provide some insights on what we think is important on what's on the transparency, but also maybe there's a role there as well. I don't know. And there's others as well. So I think I've heard that call, and I certainly will say, don't hesitate to reach out if you see opportunities where business input would be useful in these conversations. That's for sure. So thank you, Alejandro. I think, again, I'll just end on stressing the urgency. Like, we really cannot. We don't. It's the time. We need to move now. I'll stop. There.
I keep on trying to protect everyone by going back on mute. As my grandmother used to say, be careful of letting the wish become the father of the thought. So the ambition to get going seems to be shared by all. The reality puts a little brake on things, as we've heard from Hamid and others. So that's a nice segue over to Simon to care for the system first. Simon.
Thank you, Jonathan. Look, I can't think of the number of times I've heard diplomats from small and medium-sized economies in Geneva tell me how much they need this system. Yeah, I've even heard some diplomats from bigger countries say that as well. And I think we need to ask ourselves if, given where we are at, and I'm not going to inventory the problems, they've all been articulated here, how do we turn this statement that we support the system and the system is vital for our national interest into some type of action? And it would seem that collective action is increasingly difficult. Where it can happen, great. But I think if we can't act collectively, then governments who say they need the system need to start thinking about unilateral action, but not the type of unilateral action that we get from some of our larger members, but a unilateral action which actually shows that these principles have value and that countries are willing to live by them. And I think the time has come for those countries which have said that they need a rules-based system, their prosperity depends on it, their standards of living depend on it. They need to start translating that into a strategy and into action. And if anyone wants to talk about this, I'm happy to engage in that conversation. And I think this will be a complement to whatever gets accomplished decided at the General Council or in other fora. So I would put on the table a positive unilateral track, in addition to counter the regression that we've heard and seen so much of in the past year or two.
Well, thank you so much for bringing it home with a renewed optimistic tone. I know you'll remain proactive, as will the Friends of Multilateralism group itself, in reminding people of the value of investing. There's an analogy to climate change, of course, where each of us can do our part by being responsible and proactive and reminding our neighbors of the right thing to do. So very much appreciate all of you for your meaningful and thoughtful reflections. I think we all take home more food for thought and for action, as Simon is pleading with us to do by way of follow-up. So with that, we've reached time in any event. I want to again thank all three of our prime speakers and to all of you who have joined. It's a good turnout and a good number today. And we look forward to reconvening sooner rather than later. So thank you again.